now. We've got our own Richard Flynn and Managing Director, Charles Schwab, UK. Richard, things are busy over there across the pond. You've got everything going on. You've got the heads of states from the U.S. and China over there. You've got London Tech Week happening. You've got Jensen Huang over there. Let's start out with talking about Nvidia and the latest there. Look, shares of Nvidia have been moving higher over the past month, and then you have a potential catalyst happening over there. What's this about the AI, the supercharged sandbox? What's happening there?
Yeah, morning, Diane. You're right. It's a busy week here in London. It is Tech Week, and the government have really put tech and AI at the forefront of its plans for the national economy. And yesterday, Prime Minister Keir Starmer kicked off Tech Week with a presentation alongside Jensen Huang, and it was a really interesting few minutes. Jensen Huang was very complimentary about the UK as a crucible of tech development, and he pointed out that behind the US and China, the UK is the third largest investor in AI. He was also very complimentary about the history of computing science in the UK and the history of innovation, the quality of our institutions. Obviously, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College were all referenced, as well as the history of scientific breakthroughs. He actually talked about the fact that DNA was discovered in the UK, and that's how I guess he views AI as a similar catalyst to human development and understanding. What happened, which was of interest to our industry, is that Nvidia also announced a tie-up with the UK regulator, the FCA, to create a sandbox to allow UK fintech firms to safely develop AI tools in a way that can help drive growth in the industry, but within the confines of the regulatory space, which is really interesting for financial firms in the UK and hopefully for investors in the UK, because it will allow for the next iteration, the next stage of financial services and the provision of financial services to investors using AI safely, which is really important. So objectively, I think it's a really good thing to see the government, the regulator, and companies like Nvidia coming together in a sensible way. I think it's going to be a good thing for the economy. And obviously the government is, like I said, it's really pushing the strengths that the UK has with regards to AI as the foundation of hopefully the next generation of growth here in the UK.
What kind of AI use cases do you see coming out of this? Is this about like fraud detection, essentially cybersecurity, et cetera, especially when you talk about, just kind of the safety and the guardrails around AI?
Yeah, I think all of the above, Diane. Obviously, AML and safety, fraud prevention is all pretty important. But I think one of the things that's very useful here is the advice boundary review, which is something that's been discussed a lot in the last few years. Here in the UK, there's a really significant advice gap. The delivery of financial advice is very expensive. It's because of the regulatory involvement in provision of financial advice. It means that there are millions of investors for whom financial advice is simply just too expensive. And so the idea of giving guidance about investments or helping people to make investment decisions, it's been tricky to do that, profitably using human advisors. And what companies want to do is use software, use AI to be able to guide investors in a sensible manner to making good investment decisions that lead to good outcomes. And AI is going to be a big part of that. So I think the FCA, the regulator here, is quite keen to make sure that these sandbox, developments between fintech firms and Nvidia and the FCA get to a good outcome there, and that hopefully more people in the UK, more investors, can invest sensibly using these tools to make good decisions.
So what do you think this does for the competitive positioning of UK markets, especially considering you and I have had this conversation about some of the outperformance we've seen of international markets compared to the U.S. For instance, I've been seeing the FTSE 100 seeking record after record recently. So what does this do? Does this kind of attract more investment when you think about fintech?
Yeah, well, I think with that investment in fintech is a really interesting space, actually. And this week, there's been some interesting developments on that front. Not necessarily positive. I think there was some discussions or some people, some quotes from very senior people in the fintech world who said that the UK is very good at startups, but not very good at scaling up. And what we've seen this week is three very successful UK firms who've been bought by US private equity or by US firms to help them grow and develop. And that's an indicator that for the fintech space to really grow and become a significant component of the FTSE, firstly, you have to have those companies growing here in the UK. And secondly, they have to be able to list in the UK so that the actual environment, the liquidity, the capital markets here in the UK needs to be attractive to those companies rather than listing in the US, for example. So these will be good companies. The question is whether UK investors will get the benefit of that or whether it'll be US investors. And ultimately, these companies will grow outside of the UK, having been born here. So there is a really broad mandate and a big challenge for the UK, for the government, and for the Chancellor to create an environment that allows UK fintech firms to grow, to scale, and to attract investment in the right way here in the UK, rather than having to rely on the huge resources and liquidity of the US market.
Richard, I want to ask you one quick follow-up question about that. So you're essentially mentioning like what we're seeing in terms of some of the UK IPOs and maybe a shift to US listing. And so there's been some, reduction, I guess, of listings there, or not the same level of attractiveness. But at the same time, the IPO market hasn't been as hot as it was expected here in the US. So with regard to the UK, in terms of the attractiveness of listing there, is it more of like a cyclical hiccup, or is this a structural thing?
I think it's probably the latter, Diane. Personally, just observationally, you obviously, as you mentioned, IPOs globally have reduced in the last 10, 15 years. So it's not specific to the UK, but the UK definitely has a challenge in making it attractive for firms to list here as an option, given how now globally interconnected the world is and how it is easier to list in the US than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago, for example, for an international firm. I think what's of note is the government is aware of that. And in fact, what they're currently in the process of doing is debating the pension schemes bill in Parliament. And last year, the Chancellor announced in her Mansion House Accords a voluntary requirement of defined contribution pension schemes to invest 10% in private market and infrastructure, and half of that needs to be in the UK. So effectively, the government is putting a semi-mandate on these huge pension funds to invest in UK firms. And in order for that to be attractive, they need to be UK listed, for example. They need to be firms that are going to be profitable and actually attractive to these investment managers. So they're playing with all the tools at their disposal to try and drive investment here in the UK. But it is a competitive world, and no more competitive in the world of fintech, which really crosses borders very easily. So a lot of challenges for the UK government, but it's good to see a lot of noise, a lot of business taking place this week at Tech Week here in London.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure you're also trying to avoid, I'm sure there's a lot of traffic happening as well. All right, Richard, thank you. That's Richard Flynn, Managing Director, Charles Schwab UK. Appreciate the insight and perspective.